When his party was about 10 yards from the platform, he shouted an order and they halted, gasping, sweating, swaying in the fierce light. The boy himself came forward, vaulted onto the platform with his cloak flying, and peered into what to him was almost complete darkness. "Where's the man with the trumpet?" Ralph, sensing his sun-blindness, answered him. "There's no man with a trumpet, only me." The boy came close and peered down at Ralph, screwing up his face as he did so. What he saw of the fair-haired boy with the creamy shell on his knees did not seem to satisfy him. He turned quickly, his black cloak circling. "Isn't there a ship, then?" Inside the floating cloak he was tall, thin, and bony, and his hair was red beneath the black cap. His face was crumpled and freckled and ugly without silliness. Out of this face stared two light blue eyes, frustrated now and turning, or ready to turn, to anger. "Isn't there a man here?" Ralph spoke to his back. "No, we're having a meeting. Come and join in." The group of cloaked boys began to scatter from close line. The tall boy shouted at them, "Choir, stand still!" Wearily obedient, the choir huddled into line and stood there swaying in the sun. Nonetheless, some began to protest faintly. "But Merridew, please, Merridew, can't we?" Then one of the boys flopped on his face in the sand and the line broke up. They heaved the fallen boy to the platform and let him lie. Merridew, his eyes staring, made the best of a bad job. "All right then, sit down. Let him alone." "But Merridew, he's always throwing a feint," said Merridew. "He did in Gibb, and Addis, and at Matins over the precentor." This last piece of shop brought sniggers from the choir, who perched like black birds on the crisscrossed trunks and examined Ralph with interest. Piggy asked no names. He was intimidated by this uniformed superiority and the offhand authority in Merridew's voice. He shrank to the other side of Ralph and busied himself with his glasses. Merridew turned to Ralph. "Aren't there any grown-ups?" "No." Merridew sat down on the trunk and looked round the circle. "Then we'll have to look after ourselves." Secure on the other side of Ralph, Piggy spoke timidly. "That's why Ralph made a meeting, so as we can decide what to do. We've heard names. That's Johnny, those two, they're twins, Sam and Eric. Which is Eric? You? No, you're Sam. I'm Sam, and I'm Eric." "We'd better all have names," said Ralph, "so I'm Ralph." "We got most names," said Piggy. "Got 'em just now." "Kid's name," said Merridew. "Why should I be Jack? I'm Merridew." Ralph turned to him quickly. This was the voice of one who knew his own mind. "Then," went on Piggy, "that boy I forget." "You're talking too much," said Jack Merridew. "Shut up, Fatty." Laughter arose. "He's not Fatty," cried Ralph. "His real name's Piggy. Piggy! Piggy! Oh, Piggy!" A storm of laughter arose, and even the tiniest child joined in. For the moment the boys were a closed circuit of sympathy with Piggy outside. He went very pink, bowed his head, and cleaned his glasses again. Finally the laughter died away, and the naming continued. There was Maurice, next in size among the choir boys to Jack, but broad and grinning all the time. There was a slight furtive boy, whom no one knew, who kept to himself with an inner intensity of avoidance and secrecy. He muttered that his name was Roger, and was silent again. Bill, Robert, Harold, Henry, the choir boy who had fainted, sat up against a palm trunk, smiled pallidly at Ralph, and said that his name was Simon. Jack spoke. "We've got to decide about being rescued." There was a buzz. One of the small boys, Henry, said that he wanted to go home. "Shut up," said Ralph absently. He lifted the conch. "Seems to me we ought to have a chief to decide things." "A chief! A chief!" "I ought to be chief," said Jack with simple arrogance, "because I'm chapter chorister and head boy. I can sing C sharp." Another buzz. "Well then," said Jack, "I—" He hesitated. The dark boy Roger stirred at last and spoke up. "Let's have a vote." "Yes, vote for chief! Let's vote!" This toy of voting was almost as pleasing as the conch. Jack started the protest, but the clamor changed from the general wish for a chief to an election by a claim of Ralph himself. None of the boys could have found good reason for this. What intelligence had been shown was traceable to Piggy, while the most obvious leader was Jack, but there was a stillness about Ralph as he sat that marked him out. There was his size and attractive appearance, and most obscurely, yet most powerfully, there was the conch. The being that had blown that had sat waiting for them on the platform, with the delicate thing balanced on his knees, was set apart. "Him with the shell! Ralph! Ralph! Let him be chief, with the trumpet thing!" Ralph raised a hand for silence. "All right, who wants Jack for chief?" With dreary obedience the choir raised their hands. "Who wants me?" Every hand outside the choir except Piggy's was raised immediately. Then Piggy, too, raised his hand grudgingly into the air. Ralph counted. "I'm chief, then." The circle of boys broke into applause. Even the choir applauded, and the freckles on Jack's face disappeared under a blush of mortification. He started up, then changed his mind, and sat down again while the air rang. Ralph looked at him, eager to offer something. "The choir belongs to you, of course. They could be the army, or hunters. They could be—" The suffusion drained away from Jack's face. Ralph waved again for silence. "Jack's in charge of the choir. They can be— What do you want them to be?" "Hunters." Jack and Ralph smiled at each other with shy liking. The rest began to talk eagerly. Jack stood up. "All right, choir, take off your togs." As if released from class, the choir boys stood up, chattered, piled their black cloaks on the grass. Jack laid his on the trunk by Ralph. His gray shorts were sticking to him with sweat. Ralph glanced at them admiringly, and when Jack saw his glance, he explained, "I tried to get over that hill to see if there was water all around, but your shell called us." Ralph smiled and held up the conch for silence. "Listen, everybody. I've got to have time to think things out. I can't decide what to do straight off. If this isn't an island, we might be rescued straight away. So we've got to decide if this is an island. Everybody must stay round here and wait and not go away. 3 of us, if we take more we'd get all mixed and lose each other. 3 of us will go on an expedition and find out. I'll go and Jack and... He looked round the circle of eager faces. There was no lack of boys to choose from. And Simon. The boys round Simon giggled and he stood up laughing a little. Now that the pallor of his faint was over, he was a skinny, vivid little boy with a glance coming up from under a hut of straight hair that hung down, black and coarse. He nodded at Ralph. "I'll come." "And I." Jack snatched from behind him a sizable sheath knife and clouded it into a trunk. The buzz rose and died away. Piggy stirred. "I'll come." Ralph turned to him. "You're no good on a job like this. All the same—" "We don't want you," said Jack flatly. "3's enough." Piggy's glasses flashed. "I was with him when he found the conch. I was with him before anyone else was." Jack and the others paid no attention. There was a general dispersal. Ralph, Jack, and Simon jumped off the platform and walked along the sand past the bathing pool. Piggy hung bumbling behind them. "If Simon walks in the middle of us," said Ralph, "then we could talk over his head." The 3 of them fell into step. This meant that every now and then Simon had to do a double shuffle to catch up with the others. Presently Ralph stopped and turned back to Piggy. "Look!" Jack and Simon pretended to notice nothing. They walked on. "You can't come." Piggy's glasses were misted again, this time with humiliation. "You told him. After what I said." His face flushed, his mouth trembled. "After I said I didn't want— What on earth are you talking about?" "About being called Piggy. I said I didn't care as long as they didn't call me Piggy. And I said not to tell. And then you went and said, straight out." Stillness descended on them. Ralph, looking with more understanding at Piggy, saw that he was hurt and crushed. He hovered between the 2 courses of apology or further insult. "Better Piggy than Fatty," he said at last, with the directness of genuine leadership. "And anyway, I'm sorry if you feel like that. Piggy and take names. That's your job. So long." He turned and raced after the other 2. Piggy stood and the rose of indignation faded slowly from his cheeks. He went back to the platform. The 3 boys walked briskly on the sand. The tide was low and there was a strip of weed-strewn beach that was almost as firm as a road. A kind of glamour was spread over them, and the scene, and they were conscious of the glamour and made happy by it. They turned to each other, laughing excitedly, talking, not listening. The air was bright. Ralph, faced by the task of translating all this into an explanation, stood on his head and fell over. When they had done laughing, Simon stroked Ralph's arm shyly, and they had to laugh again. "Come on," said Jack presently. "We're explorers." "We'll go to the end of the island," said Ralph, "and look round the corner." "If it is an island." Now toward the end of the afternoon the mirages were settling a little. They found the end of the island quite distinct and not magicked out of shape or sense. There was a jumble of the usual squareness, with one great block sitting out in the lagoon. Seabirds were nesting there. "Like icing," said Ralph, "on a pink cake." "We shan't see round this corner," said Jack, "because there isn't one. Only a slow curve, and you can see the rocks get worse." Ralph shaded his eyes and followed the jagged outline of the crags up toward the mountain. This part of the beach was nearer the mountain than any other they had seen. "We'll try climbing the mountain from here," he said. "I should think this is the easiest way. There's less of that jungly stuff and more pink rock. Come on." The 3 boys began to scramble up. Some unknown force had wrenched and shattered these cubes so that they lay askew, often piled diminishingly on each other. The most usual feature of the rock was a pink cliff surmounted by a skewed block, and that again surmounted, and that again, till the pinkness became a stack of balanced rock projecting through the looped fantasy of the forest creepers. Where the pink cliffs rose out of the ground, there were often narrow tracks winding upwards. They could edge along them deep in the plant world, their faces to the rock. What made this track? Jack paused, wiping the sweat from his face. Ralph stood by him, breathless. Men? Jack shook his head. Animals. Ralph peered into the darkness under the trees, the forest minutely vibrating. "Come on." The difficulty was not the steep ascent round the shoulders of rock, but the occasional plunges through the undergrowth to get to the next path. Here the roots and stems of creepers were in such tangles that the boys had to thread through them like pliant needles. Their only guide, apart from the brown ground and occasional flashes of light through the foliage, was the tendency of slope, whether this hole, laced as it was with the cables of creeper, stood higher than that. Somehow they moved up. Immured in these tangles, at perhaps their most difficult moment, Ralph turned with shining eyes to the others. "Wacko! Wizard! Smashing!" The cause of their pleasure was not obvious. All 3 were hot, dirty, and exhausted. Ralph was badly scratched. The creepers were as thick as their thighs, and left little but tunnels for further penetration. Ralph shouted experimentally, and they listened to the muted echoes. "This is real exploring," said Jack. "I bet nobody's been here before." "We ought to draw a map," said Ralph, "only we haven't any paper." "We could make scratches on bark," said Simon, "and rub black stuff in." Again came the solemn communion of shining eyes in the gloom. Wacko! Wizard! There was no place for standing on one's head. This time Ralph expressed the intensity of his emotion by pretending to knock Simon down, and soon they were a happy heaving pile in the underdusk. When they had fallen apart, Ralph spoke first. "Gotta get on." The pink granite of the next cliff was further back from the creepers and trees so that they could trot up the path. This again led into more open forest so that they had a glimpse of the spread sea. With openness came the sun. It dried the sweat that had soaked their clothes in the dark, damp heat. At last the way to the top looked like a scramble over pink rock. With no more plunging through darkness, the boys chose their way through defiles and over heaps of sharp stone. "Look, look!" High over this end of the island, the shattered rocks lifted up their stacks and chimneys. This one, against which Jack leaned, moved with a grating sound when they pushed.